It was a peaceful night in Prospect, Connecticut, a quiet town where neighbors slept soundly, comforted by its stillness. But just before dawn, the silence was broken. Smoke filled the air, screams echoed in the dark, and flames engulfed a family home. By the time firefighters arrived, it was too late. 9 lives were lost, each one brutally taken before the fire consumed the evidence of a horrifying act. Now, here's the question. If your ex-convict foster brother knocked on your door in the middle of the night, would you let him in? Cheryl did, and what followed would haunt her family, her neighbors, and an entire community forever. Stay tuned as we explore the devastating truth behind one of Connecticut's darkest nights. Like, comment, and subscribe for more stories that demand to be told. Welcome to Crime Catalog. The Bowden family lived on Cedar Hill Drive in Prospect, Connecticut, a small, close-knit town where neighbors knew one another by name. In 1977, Prospect was home to just over 6,500 residents, offering a sense of security and simplicity that made it feel worlds away from the dangers of the outside world. It was the kind of place where doors were left unlocked, and laughter from children playing in yards carried on the breeze. For Frederick and Cheryl Bowden, it was the perfect setting to raise their large family. At just 29 years old, Cheryl was the heart of the household, juggling the endless needs of 7 children and their 6-year-old niece, Jennifer. Each child brought their own spark to the lively home. 12-year-old Frederick Jr., the eldest and often the protector; Sharon Lee, a vibrant 10-year-old; 9-year-old Deborah, and with her mischievous smile; 8-year-old Paul, who was full of curiosity; 6-year-old Rodri, Jennifer's closest playmate; 5-year-old Holly Lynn with her infectious giggles; and 4-year-old Mary Lou, the baby of the group. Their days were filled with the noise and chaos of a bustling family. But above all, there was love and warmth. Frederick Sr., the father, worked tirelessly at the Pratt & Whitney factory on 3rd shift to support his family. Though his job kept him away during the nights, he found comfort in knowing Cheryl's watchful eye kept their home a safe and nurturing place. Life wasn't extravagant for the Bowdens, but it was full. They made the most of what they had, creating memories and cherishing moments of joy. The evening of July 21, 1977, was no exception. It was a warm summer night, and the children were brimming with energy. They spent hours splashing and laughing in the neighbor's pool, their carefree joy lighting up the neighborhood. Cheryl stood nearby, keeping a watchful eye as she chatted with a neighbor. It was a scene of innocence, a moment of pure, uncomplicated happiness. For the Bowden children, it was just another magical evening of summer fun. As the sun dipped below the horizon, a visitor appeared. Lauren Ine, Cheryl's foster brother-in-law, arrived unexpectedly. His presence was met with delight by the children, who ran to greet him with hugs and kisses. To them, he wasn't a stranger but someone they trusted and welcomed without question. Lauren had once lived in the Bowden home, sharing their lives for 2 years before leaving abruptly. Now, his sudden return seemed like a reunion, a chance to reconnect with the family he had once been a part of. To the neighbors, the sight of Lauren at the pool that night might have seemed unremarkable, a family member stopping by to say hello. But looking back, his presence would take on a far darker meaning. In the moment, however, there was no hint of the tragedy to come. The children finished their swim, said their goodnights, and returned home with Cheryl and Lauren. That night, the Bowden household settled into its usual routine, with laughter still echoing in the children's minds as they drifted off to sleep. Yet, as the hours passed and the town grew quiet, the family's sense of safety would be shattered. Lauren Ine's unexpected visit wasn't just a reunion. It was the beginning of a night that would forever change the lives of everyone in Prospect, Connecticut. That summer night, the Bowden family returned home from the neighbor's pool, the children tired but happy from their hours of play. Cheryl herded them inside, their laughter fading as they climbed the stairs to their bedrooms. Lauren Ine accompanied them, stepping into the familiar space he had once called home. For Cheryl, it must have seemed natural. Lauren had been part of their lives before. Family, after all. As the house settled into its nighttime rhythm, no one could have imagined what the darkness held. Lauren's connection to the Bowden family ran deep. Years earlier, he had lived in their basement for 2 years, a fixture in their bustling household. Frederick and Cheryl had extended their generosity, offering him a place to stay when he needed it most. Yet Lauren's time there hadn't been without complications. His temper, his unpredictability, and his brushes with the law left an uneasy shadow. By 1976, He was gone, disappearing from their lives as abruptly as he had entered them. The family carried on, their home once again their own. Lauren's absence was far from uneventful. In April of 1974, he had been sentenced to prison for larceny. His time behind bars was short-lived, but his behavior in the years that followed was erratic at best. An escape attempt in 1976 landed him back in custody, a desperate act that painted a troubling picture of a man prone to reckless decisions. Released on parole in September of 1976, he had barely begun to rebuild his life when he reappeared at the Bowden home. For neighbors who knew the family, Lauren's return was a surprise, but not necessarily alarming. The small town of Prospect wasn't the kind of place where suspicions lingered long. Yet there were those who noticed something peculiar that night. Hours after the family returned home, Lauren's black sedan was spotted parked in the lot of a nearby church. It sat there motionless, its presence unremarkable to some, but troubling to others. What reason could he have had to linger so close, so late? The night stretched on, quiet and still. Inside the house, the family slept, their guard down in the one place they believed they were safest. The image of Lauren waiting in that car lingers, his figure hidden in the shadows, the vehicle a silent witness to his thoughts. Did he hesitate? Did he wrestle with the weight of what he was about to do? Or was his mind already made up? His return to the Bowden home part of a calculated plan? To the neighbors who would later piece together the events of that night, the memory of the black sedan became a chilling reminder of how close they had been to the unimaginable. Could they have done something? Should they have acted when they noticed a car that didn't belong? It's a question that haunts, one worth asking. What would you have done if you saw someone lingering near your neighbor's home late at night? Would you have intervened, or would you have brushed it off as nothing more than an unusual coincidence? By the time the first signs of trouble surfaced, a plume of smoke, the faint sound of screams, it was already too late. The Bowden family's home, a place once filled with joy and life, had become the stage for a tragedy that no one in Prospect would ever forget. The early hours of July 22, 1977, began in silence, the kind that blankets a small town before dawn. At 4:15 a.m., that silence was broken. A plume of smoke rose into the sky over Cedar Hill Drive, visible even in the darkness. Neighbors stirred, some noticing the acrid scent of burning wood and plastic. Others awoke to the sound of screams, brief, chilling, and unforgettable. Calls to 911 followed, and firefighters from Prospect and Bethany raced toward the source of the chaos, the Bowden family home. When the fire crews arrived, flames consumed the house, the heat forcing responders to keep their distance. The fire raged, defying their efforts, but they worked tirelessly, battling it back until the blaze finally surrendered. What they found inside the charred remains of the house was something no amount of training could prepare them for. The bodies of Cheryl Bowden, her 7 children, and their 6-year-old niece Jennifer, were discovered throughout the home. Cheryl's body was found in the kitchen, her hands bound behind her back. Her injuries told a horrific story. She had been struck repeatedly, her life taken before the fire could reach her. In the bedrooms, firefighters found the children, their small bodies scattered. Some had been tied, others showed signs of severe trauma. The youngest had been killed in their sleep, their lives stolen in an act of incomprehensible cruelty. Gasoline soaked the floors, the walls, and the bodies, ensuring the fire would consume all traces of the nightmare that had unfolded. As investigators combed through the scene, one question loomed larger than the rest. Who could have done this? That answer came just hours later when police turned their focus to Lauren Ine, the family's foster brother-in-law. Lauren had been at the Bowden home the night before. He had eaten with the family, laughed with the children, and been welcomed as one of their own. But his presence that evening wasn't the friendly visit it seemed. When questioned by police, Lauren confessed. His words were devoid of remorse, chilling in their detail. He admitted to returning to the house in the early hours of the morning, entering through the unlocked basement door. Cheryl, hearing the sound of movement, came downstairs. She found Lauren in the kitchen, casually claiming he needed tools to fix his car. Trusting him, she turned her back to retrieve a drink. That moment of trust cost her everything. Lauren struck her with a wrench, hitting her repeatedly. When Cheryl showed signs of life, he moved to ensure she wouldn't survive, using a knife to end her suffering. Lauren didn't stop there. He turned his attention to the children, who were asleep in their rooms. He described his actions with horrifying clarity, tying some of the children and attacking others where they lay. He doused the house and the bodies with gasoline, ensuring that flames would erase the evidence of his brutality. By the time he fled, the fire he started had begun its devastating work. As Lauren's confession poured out, investigators and townspeople alike struggled to comprehend the depth of his actions. How could someone who had been welcomed as family turn on them so completely? How could anyone inflict such pain on innocent children? The news reached Frederick Bowden while he was at work, where police came to escort him to his mother's house. They didn't tell him the full story at first, only that there had been an incident. It was there, in the presence of his pastor, that Frederick learned the truth. His entire family, his wife, his children, and his niece, had been taken from him in a single night. The weight of that loss was unbearable. Through tears, he asked the unthinkable, "Are they all dead?" When the answer came, his world shattered. For Frederick, the pain was more than just the loss. It was the betrayal. Lauren wasn't just a stranger. He was someone Frederick had trusted, someone he had welcomed into his home. That trust had been repaid with violence of the worst kind. Frederick's grief turned to resolve. "There's only one thing to do," he reportedly said. "Make the bastard pay." The horrific events of that night left a scar on the town of Prospect, one that lingers to this day. The memory of the Bowden family, their laughter, their love, their innocence, was overshadowed by the brutality of their deaths. Yet their story remains a reminder of how fragile trust can be, and how even the safest places can hide unimaginable dangers. The scene investigators encountered inside the Bowden home was almost too much to bear. The fire had burned away much of the evidence, but what remained told a story of calculated violence. Every door and window was locked, leaving no sign of forced entry. The implication was chilling. Whoever had committed these crimes either knew the family well enough to gain their trust or had locked the house from within after the murders. It was the first of many disturbing clues. Police quickly began questioning neighbors and anyone who might have seen or heard something that night. The name Lauren Ine came up repeatedly. Neighbors recalled his visit to the Bowden home earlier that evening and, more alarmingly, his black sedan parked near a church just a mile from the house in the early hours of the morning. Lauren wasn't just a visitor. He was a person of interest. When police approached Lauren for questioning, he surprised them by coming willingly. He showed no signs of resistance and remained calm as they began their interrogation. That calmness didn't waver, even as he confessed to the murders in chilling detail. Lauren described how he entered the house through the unlocked basement door, how Cheryl came downstairs to investigate, and how he struck her with a wrench when her back was turned. He recounted tying up some of the children, attacking them one by one, and dousing the house with gasoline before setting it ablaze. His words painted a horrifying picture, and his demeanor only made it more unsettling. There was no remorse, no hesitation, just a cold recounting of events. To ensure the accuracy of his confession, police questioned Lauren multiple times. Each time, his story remained consistent, even when his psychiatrist was brought in to observe him. The confession was so detailed, so specific, that investigators couldn't ignore its validity. Lauren seemed to know things only the killer would, details that hadn't been released to the public and couldn't have been guessed. It seemed like an open and shut case. But then, contradictions began to emerge. Despite his initial confession, Lauren later recanted, claiming he was coerced by the police and his psychiatrist. He insisted he had been pressured to confess, believing it would somehow work in his favor. His demeanor shifted, now filled with defiance rather than calm compliance. He denied every word of his earlier statements and presented a new story, claiming he had nothing to do with the murders. The physical evidence only deepened the mystery. Investigators found fingerprints at the scene that didn't match Lauren, Cheryl, or any of the children. These prints remained unidentified, raising questions about whether Lauren had acted alone, or if someone else had been in the house that night. Lauren's defense team seized on this discrepancy, using it to cast doubt on the confession and the investigation as a whole. Lauren's mental state further complicated the case. He had a history of erratic behavior and had been diagnosed with potential schizophrenia. His time in and out of prison painted a picture of a man struggling with control and impulse. Was his confession the product of a troubled mind? Or was it the cold truth, spoken without remorse by someone fully aware of his actions. Despite the mounting evidence, questions lingered. The unmatched fingerprints, Lauren's shifting stories, and his unpredictable behavior left room for speculation. Could someone else have been involved? Was there another layer to this tragedy that had yet to be uncovered? The small town of Prospect was left grappling with these uncertainties, its sense of safety shattered and its trust forever broken. As investigators pieced together the events of that night, one thing became clear: the horror of the Bowden family's final moments would haunt everyone involved. For the police, the neighbors, and even the town itself, the unanswered questions only added to the weight of an already unbearable loss. The trial of Lauren Ine began under a heavy cloud of grief and anger. For the town of Prospect and the grieving father, Frederick Bowden, it was not just about seeking justice for Cheryl and the children. It was about confronting the unimaginable betrayal that had shattered their lives. Lauren entered the courtroom as the accused murderer of 9 innocent lives, his calm demeanor now replaced by defiance and denial. What followed was a legal battle as haunting as the crime itself. From the start, the prosecution built its case on Lauren's detailed confession, which outlined the sequence of events with chilling clarity. The confession alone might have been enough, but investigators also presented damning physical evidence. Bloodied clothes, matching the victims, had been found near Lauren's home, along with his shoes and socks, stained with blood, discovered in the trunk of his car. These items, combined with his confession, formed the backbone of the case. The defense, however, was prepared to fight. Lauren's lawyer argued that the confession had been coerced, pointing to Lauren's claims of being pressured by the police and his psychiatrist. They painted him as a vulnerable man with a history of mental health issues, suggesting that he had been manipulated into admitting to crimes he didn't commit. Lauren himself took the stand, retracting his confession and insisting on his innocence. He claimed the blood on his clothes came from a fight with strangers the same night as the murders, a story investigators and the jury found implausible. Adding to the courtroom drama were the victims' photographs, introduced by the prosecution. The images of Cheryl and the children, innocent and smiling, were presented to the jury as a stark reminder of the lives that had been taken. When the photographs were shown, a hush fell over the courtroom. The weight of the tragedy was unmistakable, and several jurors were visibly moved. Lauren's defense objected, claiming the images were overly prejudicial, but the judge allowed them, citing their importance to the case. The prosecution also addressed the unmatched fingerprints found at the scene, a key point the defense had used to sow doubt. While the prints didn't belong to Lauren or the victims, the prosecution argued there was no evidence to suggest another person was involved. They pointed to the overwhelming consistency of Lauren's confession, the timeline of events, and the physical evidence that tied him directly to the crime. After weeks of testimony, arguments, and counter-arguments, the jury deliberated. For 3 days, they reviewed the evidence, weighed the conflicting narratives, and considered Lauren's shifting accounts of the night. In the end, they delivered their verdict: guilty on all counts of murder. Lauren was sentenced to life in prison, with the possibility of parole after 50 years. It was a sentence that sparked mixed reactions. For some, the possibility of parole was a bitter pill to swallow. How could a man who had committed such a monstrous crime ever be considered for release? Others argued that life in prison, isolated and forgotten, was a fitting punishment for someone who had betrayed the trust of a family and destroyed so many lives. The debate over whether justice was truly served lingered long after the trial ended. For Frederick Bowden, the verdict brought some closure but little comfort. The loss of his family was a wound that would never heal. He had trusted Lauren as a member of his household, and that trust had been turned against him in the most horrific way imaginable. Now, all he could do was carry their memory forward and ensure their story was never forgotten. Lauren Ine would spend the rest of his life behind bars, his appeals repeatedly denied. The trial and its aftermath left a scar on the town of Prospect, a reminder that even in the most peaceful places, unimaginable acts can occur. For those who knew the Bowden family, their laughter and love would always be remembered, a light that no crime could extinguish. As the years passed, the case of the Bowden family massacre continued to haunt those who remembered it. While the trial had brought some answers, many questions remained. Chief among them was the mystery of the fingerprints found at the crime scene. Despite exhaustive efforts, they didn't match Lauren, the victims, or anyone else connected to the case. Who did they belong to? Were they left by someone who had escaped detection, Or were they simply a remnant of the family's everyday life, now magnified by the tragedy? Lauren's claims of coercion also cast a long shadow. He maintained that his confession had been forced, an accusation his defense used to argue that the police had pushed a mentally unstable man into admitting guilt. Lauren's diagnosis of potential schizophrenia further complicated this narrative. Did his mental state distort his perception of events, or was it a convenient excuse to shift blame? Forensic psychologists debated whether his actions were the result of calculated intent or a mind unraveling under the weight of its own demons. Lauren's life in prison was marked by isolation and decline. Over the decades, he accumulated disciplinary infractions but never gained significant sympathy for his plight. In his final years, his health deteriorated, leading to a severe medical crisis in 2015. Alone and with no family to advocate for him, he was placed on a ventilator. Shortly after, he passed away from a brain bleed. No autopsy was performed, and his death left as many questions as his life. His ashes remained unclaimed, a stark reminder of a man who, in the end, had no one left to care. Yet, even with Lauren gone, the lingering mysteries endure. Was he truly the sole perpetrator? Could someone else have been involved, either during the crime or in its planning? And if so, why was no one else ever identified? These unanswered questions continue to cast doubt and invite speculation. The legacy of the Bowden family massacre is one of loss and betrayal. Cheryl's trust in a family member led to a tragedy that no one could have foreseen. The children, who greeted Lauren with open arms, paid the ultimate price for that trust. For Frederick, the pain of losing his entire family was compounded by the knowledge that their killer had once been part of their lives. As we look back on this case, we ask you, do you believe Lauren acted alone, or is it possible someone else played a role? Was justice served with his life sentence, or did the system fail the Bowden family? Share your thoughts in the comments. This story is more than a recounting of facts. It's a reflection on trust, family, and the fragility of safety. If this case moved you, please support our channel by liking this video, leaving a comment, and subscribing for more true crime stories like this one. Every interaction helps us continue to bring these stories to light. The Bowden family story is one of trust betrayed and lives destroyed, leaving a scar on a community that we'll never forget.